My watch tells me it's a little over 3:15, so I'm going to get started. We are hoping that Abe Schoener arrives, and he may walk in, but for now, I want to introduce just very briefly Michon Matthiesen to my left and Lanta Davis, who will be speaking, and then when Abe arrives, he'll join me here and I'll introduce him more fully. But if I could, I'd like to introduce Michon, who is actually a dear and old friend of mine, which is really nice that I get a chance to do this. We met many years ago. I'm really glad to be
here at Notre Dame.
Yeah, here at Notre Dame. Okay, so who is Michon? Well, she's Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Mary, which is in Bismarck, North Dakota. And she's been teaching there since 2014. In previous jobs, she has taught at Providence College, St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, and her groundbreaking book, Sacrifice as Gift, Eucharist, Grace, and Contemplative Prayer in Maurice de la Taille, retrieves an important work of this great Jesuit theologian who illuminated the doctrine of the Mass as a sacrifice. Though primarily a sacramental and liturgical theologian, Professor Matthiessen's scholarly interests take her into areas of Christian spirituality and cross-disciplinary work in theology and literature. And her current book project is entitled Unveiling Envy, the Great Anti-Life Sin, and it's, is it Abe?
Sorry, I was waiting for the doors to open.
Oh my goodness, you got locked out. Well, Abe, do you mind going second?
No, not at all.
Okay, because Michon's going to go first.
Well, sometimes people rotate through at these conferences to hear certain people.
So you're suggesting maybe we start with Abe. Well, now you know Michon, I'm going to introduce you to Abe, okay? She gives me counsel at any moment that I may need it. I think this is good counsel. Abe, glad you're here. Abe, this is interesting. Abe is the founder and winemaker of the Scholium project. Did you know that Michon also was involved in wine? We could talk later. We want to get to it. But he received his doctorate from the University of Toronto, previously served as a professor in classics at St. John's College in Annapolis. And after taking a sabbatical from academia in 1998 to study grape growing, he made the leap into winemaking. He later launched the Scholium project, known for its experimental winemaking process, earning him a profile in the New York Times, which called him the fearless, risk-loving winemaker. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Abe. Are you going to sit there, Abe?
I think I'll stand up.
Okay,
Thank
you're
you.
going to stand up. All right, good. Go to it, and why don't you give a warm round of applause to Abe? Okay, he's here. He's ready. He'll give you the title.
And I'm so sorry to have been tardy and to have interrupted the order of things. Can you guys hear me okay?
Good. Now, speaking of time and tardiness, did you see that woman in the brown shirt?
Yes.
She's draconian in her timing.
I look forward.
So she will hold up a sign when there's 5 minutes and when there's 2, yes. We'd
Amazing.
like to have discussion, of course, afterwards. So
I'll pay close attention.
very good.
It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to participate in this community of scholars for a few days. My day job, as you've heard, is making wine. The opportunity for the reflections that this conference offers me is nearly unbelievable, and it's deeply renewing. This little paper is going to undertake philology in 3 languages, in 3 main texts, to help lay the groundwork for thinking about the soul in relation to the imagination. We'll begin in the first account of creation at chapter 1, verse 26 of Genesis. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the heavens, and over the animals, and over all the earth, and over all the creeping things that creep upon the earth." So God created man in his image. In the image of God did he create him, male and female, he created them. In the first verse, there's a kind of periphrasis, a double expression, describing the creation of man. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." There's a certain repetition of this in the second verse. God created man in his image. In the image of God did he create him. Of the pair in the first verse, there's a repetition of only one of the two words. Image is said 3 times in the 2 verses, likeness only once. In the first verse, it is not clear what the syntactic relation is between the 2 words image and likeness. They're in a syndeton, not connected by a conjunction. In our image, after our likeness. Is likeness in addition to image, so that man is both an image and a likeness of God? Or is the second word a precision of the first? In other words, are they related, for instance, as genus is to species? If so, one of the words is pleonastic. If all images are likenesses, for instance, why use both words? As Augustine cautions us, some consider that these 2 were mentioned not without reason, namely image and likeness, since, if they meant the same, one would have sufficed. The first word in Hebrew is tselem. It's a common word in the Hebrew Bible, and its other uses seem pretty clear. Sometimes it means an image in the sense of an idol, a representation that you could carry around. Sometimes an appearance or a vision, as opposed to the thing itself. At least once, it seems to mean a mere semblance. That's in Psalm 39. And perhaps this usage as semblance is like our expression in the following exchange. How did he look? Well, he's a mere shadow of his former self. And in fact, tselem is etymologically related to tsel, shadow or shade, in the sense of protection from the sun, which in turn comes from tsale, to grow dark. This, for me, is a striking etymology. The Hebrew word that is translated image turns out to be not related to something you see, to sight, to vision, to appearance, or even reflection, but instead to darkness, disappearance. In order to grasp the significance of this, one would have to reflect, I think, on what it means when we say he's a mere shadow of himself. Does this mean that he is now insubstantial? That he's now second order, depending on something primary in the same way that the shadow of the tree depends on the original tree itself? We might mean he's a lesser version of his former self, but we must recognize that here lesser is a kind of metaphor, that there's not less of him in any physical sense, and perhaps not really in any sense at all. Could it then mean, for instance, that there's less courage in him or less joy? Shadow does not differ from the original in terms of more or less. So I think it turns out that even while we know exactly what the phrase, he is a shadow of his former self, means, it's hard to say why shadow works as an expression to convey this meaning. In other words, shadow is a metaphor that we use easily and with comfort, but it's still hard to parse exactly what it means and how it works. The second work in Genesis 1:26, translated as likeness, is demut. This word simply means likeness, similitude. It's not tied to the realm of light and vision, as is tselem. Somehow it seems to stand over these. At 5:3, speaking of Seth, we have this pair again. Seth, the child of Adam and Eve. I quote, "And Adam lived 130 years, and he begot a son in his likeness, after his image, and he named him Seth." This clearly reprises the pair from 126, but reverses their order. Once again, the words are in a syndeton, in his likeness, after his image. I think that this usage makes the pair a little easier to understand than in the much more challenging first case. Seth is like Adam for sure, looks like him, etc., but he's a mere shadow. He's no Adam. You could say that repeating, emphasizing tselem, emphasizes the negative essence of the image. The image of Adam is not Adam. The image of God is not God. Part 2, there is some kind of soul. I didn't really know Hebrew at all. I'm relying on what I have read about the words. I used to know ancient Greek pretty well. I taught it in a former life. I must say how surprised I was when trying to learn about Scholium and found that it was etymologically related to the word for shadow. The paper that I gave here last year was about the relation in Homer between words for the body and words for the soul. And I must say, I danced around and did not mention the use of the word skia, shadow. Perhaps the main word used for the appearance of the dead in Homer, for what we translate as shade, is eidolon, the word for an image. It is etymologically tied to seeing, to our word video, and has no tie, unlike the Hebrew word tselem, to shade or shadow. There's a wonderful and crucial moment in the Iliad when a sleeping Achilles is visited by the shade of his recently slain friend and companion, Patroclus. Achilles falls asleep, exhausted, before he can begin the lengthy and intricate funeral rites for Patroclus. Patroclus visits him in his sleep. It's not really clear if Achilles wakes up, but in the poem they talk, and at the end of their conversation, Achilles reaches out to embrace Patroclus. I'm going to quote an abbreviated version of both the beginning and end of the scene from the Fagles translation. The ghost of stricken Patroclus drifted up. He was like a man to the life in every feature. And now cutting right to the end, Achilles stretched forth his loving arms, but could not seize him. No, the ghost slipped underground like a wisp of smoke with a high, thin cry. And Achilles sprang up with a start, and staring wide, drove his fists together and cried in desolation, "Ah, God, so even in death's strong house there is something left, a ghost, a phantom, true, but no real breath of life." The word that Fagles translates as ghost at the beginning of the passage is psyche, we might say soul, when Homer, the narrator, is speaking. This is the same word that Achilles uses later to exclaim after he tries to hug Patroclus but cannot. Even in death's strong house, there is something left, a ghost, a phantom, but no real breath of life. Achilles says literally a ghost and an image, psyche and eidolon. What is it that Achilles discovers here? Even exhausted and sleepy, he knows that the Patroclus who hovered over him, with whom he shared warm tears, is dead. He knows that he has spent the night with a mere image. What he discovers is not that there are shades in Hades, but that he cannot embrace this visiting shade, this psyche. In other words, he does not discover something like that there is an immortal or post-mortal soul. What he discovers is that this soul is insubstantial, that it has no phrenes. The lexicons say that phrenes means something like midriff. We might translate it as guts. Why does it surprise Achilles that the shade has no phrenes, no guts? Precisely because the shade, the psyche, looks wondrously and exactly like the living Patroclus. If only the ghost had looked less like living Patroclus, Achilles would not have been surprised. What Achilles learns here is not that the psyche is an immortal animating force of the body, but that the psyche is merely the wondrous eidolon, the image of the whole living body, of the living person. I must say, this emphasis on the resemblance of the soul to the living being could not help but make me think of Dante and the complex problematic this poses in the understanding of his poem. I did not have time to address this last year. Today I would like to take some time to offer a merely schematic and proleptic first steps in addressing this. But first, a note on shade and shadow in Homer. As in Hebrew, the same word is used in ancient Greek for shade, as in the shade of a tree, and shadow, the shadow that the same tree casts that may afford shade to a human being. And this word is skia. This word, in turn, is frequently used in ancient Greek literature for remains of the living being after death, what we easily translate as the shade. For this reason, it is perhaps not surprising that in English translations of Homer, specifically Homer, as in the Fagel's translation above, many different words for the dead, as in psyche above, are translated into English as shade. But almost none of them are skia or any related ancient Greek word. This word is a hapax in Homer. It's used only once in all of Homer, at Odyssey, Book 10, line 495, in the mouth of Circe, who speaks, as we English readers might expect, of the skiai, of the shades flitting about in Hades. Elsewhere, even in the long account of the visit of Odysseus that Circe urges him to make to Hades, Homer never uses this word skia or even anything similar to mean soul or ghost. The third and last section, radiant shadows in the Paradiso. I'll look up and check the time. How am I doing?
You're 12 minutes in.
At the very beginning of the Paradiso, Dante offers an invocation and asks the pagan Apollo for the power to convey what he learns on this journey. I'm going to quote from the Mandelbaum translation. O godly force, if you so lend yourself to me, that I might show the shadow of the blessed realm inscribed within my soul. The phrase in Italian is l'ombra del beato regno. Throughout the 3 books of the poem, he refers to the souls that he meets very often as ombrae. This is exactly as we would expect, I would say, based on our understanding of the English expression shade. Throughout the Purgatorio, the shades are fascinated that Dante, the traveler, casts a shadow. In a realm of shades, but where the sun still shines, only physical bodies cast shadows, and Dante is the only human or human-like being they have ever seen on the mountain. Only he can cast a shadow. The physicality of the shadow is taken so seriously that Dante proposes that he can tell what time it is by measuring the length of his shadow, his ombra. It is worth noting the double duty that this word must perform in Dante. The ombra of the pilgrim in the Purgatorio is the absence of the light of the sun due to a physical obstruction. On the other hand, the poem itself is an ombra, an image of the understanding that the pilgrim gains as a result of his amazing voyage, not merely physical, but intellectual and spiritual. The ombra of Dante the traveler is a kind of emptiness vis-a-vis the light of the sun. The ombra of Dante the poet's vision is as full as possible, the opposite of emptiness, but without in any way being the same as its original. The problematic of the two-sidedness of the ombra becomes more pointed very soon in the Paradiso. At Paradiso 5, the poet says, and even as each shade approached, one saw, because of the bright radiance it sent forth, the joyousness with which that shade was filled. The shade, the ombra, has a bright radiance that reveals what we might call its inner happiness. This paradox of an ombra, a shade or shadow, with an inner radiance, strains both our understanding and our imagination. In a certain sense, we must ignore the root meaning of ombra to even imagine or understand this scene. It is worth noting that here, in the sphere of the moon, this is the last time in the Paradiso that the souls are referred to as ombrae. Before I close, I want to look at one more scene early in the Paradiso. Normally, I limit myself to explicating the Inferno, so it is rare and difficult for me to do more than wander about in the Paradiso. I'm going to quote at length again from the Mandelbaum translation from Canto 3. But a new vision showed itself to me. The grip in which it held me was so fast that I did not remember to confess. Just as, returning through transparent clean glass, or through waters calm and crystalline, so shallow that they scarcely can reflect, the mirrored image of our faces meets our pupils with no greater force than that a pearl has when displayed on a white forehead. So faint, the many faces I saw, keen to speak. Thus, my mistake was contrary to that which led the man to love the fountain. As soon as I had noticed them, thinking that what I saw were merely mirrorings, I turned around to see who they might be, and saw nothing. And I let my sight turn back to meet the light of my dear guide, who, as she smiled, glowed in her holy eyes. There is no need to wonder if I smile, she said, because you reason like a child. Your steps do not yet rest upon the truth. Your mind misguides you into emptiness. What you are seeing are true substances, vere sustanze. Somehow the shadowy images, like reflections in water, are true substances, not the images of the souls, but the souls themselves. Thank you all so much.
And now it's time for more Dante with Michon, who I've introduced you to already. Thank you.
There is a handout that might help you with some of the quotes from the Commedia, if you need one. This paper is part of a larger project that seeks to retrieve a theologically robust approach to envy, which in our competitive North American culture has become the acceptable vice, a mere peccadillo, if even that. I am convinced that it will not suffice to simply repeat the substantial scriptural, patristic, and theological sources on envy, though this is a good, and it certainly is necessary. Yet, given the diminished moral gravity of envy, given the concealed nature of envy, and given the general cultural confusion about what constitutes envy, I suggest that a re-education of human affect and an awakening of the religious imagination is imperative. So Dante's Divine Comedy answers this need, not only with a striking diagnosis of this sin and its consequences, temporal and eternal, but also with a proposed remedy for envy that is to hand in this life. To anticipate somewhat, Dante points to a liturgical reformation of vision and will at the Eucharistic table, la mensa d'amor. Dante's most direct teaching on envy in Purgatorio Cantos 13 through the start of Canto 15 has struck scholars as stunningly compact. To grasp the full scope of his pedagogy, however, we need to give attention also to the parallel cantos of the Inferno and the Paradiso. This practice of reading the Commedia vertically is not a new one, nor is it without controversy. Unfortunately, I don't have time to defend this practice, but let me simply say this. One need not subscribe to the thesis that the whole of the comedy came to Dante in a single flash of inspiration, to note that the interweaving and overlapping of themes in distinctive areas of the three canticles. I happen to like that thesis. I find it lovely and not entirely improbable, but others are reserved in that regard. So we shall begin in the middle of the journey on the second terrace of the mountain that unsins, and then look back into the foul air of hell and forward upward into the celestial spheres to see how Dante completes his treatment of envy. So part 1, Purgatorio 13. Dante's diagnosis of the sin of envy is fundamentally evidenced by way of examining the means or the contrapasso by which this sin is undone. Yet much is revealed about envy even before the reader arrives at the memorably horrific detail of verse 70 of the eyes sewn shut with wire. In fact, Dante increases our suspense about this cornice by placing us in the company of lost travelers. Dante, Pilgrim, and Virgil enter a terrain in which the road and embankment is bare, no sign of any sort, ne segno, and all is the color of blue-gray stone. Envy is being depicted as the absence of life. Perhaps Dante also alludes here to the hiddenness of this sin. Unlike the more extroverted and colorful sin of pride, envy is concealed, interior, and self-consuming. Still, this cold barrenness stands out against the light on the terrace. It is full noon, and the terrace is bright with the warmth which enlivens the world. Dante takes full advantage here of Seneca's etymology of the Latin word invidia, or invidere, as not being able to see, or rather, not being able to tolerate the sight of the happiness, good fortune, and honor of others. The verb vedere and the noun vista appear 12 times in the canto, with another 10 occurrences of synonymous expressions of seeing. Also likely operative here is Gregory the Great's passage from the Moralia on Job 5:2. They shall meet with darkness in the daytime and grope in the noonday as in the night. Gregory's exegesis correlates this with the envious. If Dante and Virgil aren't stumbling in the night, they do proceed without compass and sign for what counts as a mile down here, before being met not with visual assistance, but with flying voices, offering courteous invitations to the table of love, the mensa d'amour. The first voice announces, vinum non habent, Mary's words to Jesus at the wedding feast in Cana. The second cries, I am Orestes, pointing to the willingness of two friends to die in place of the other. So examples then of love of neighbor and love of friendship. Before Dante can finish asking Virgil to interpret these two voices, echo, a third voice, saying, love those from whom you have had evil. This trinity of voices sounds a call to prayer, to a feasting upon charity and upon the wisdom of Christ. With the words of the third invitation from Matthew 5, the terrace begins to come into focus. Dante Pilgrim opens his eyes more than before, gradually distinguishing human shades, shoulder to shoulder against the gray cliff. They are dressed alike in horsehair, the same color as the cliff. This monotony of color and posture imposes a sameness, an equality among the penitents, thus eliminating invidious comparison. The poet then likens these souls to blind beggars who, lacking their daily bread, lean dependently one upon another in hope of charity. This embodied practice of communal reliance operates upon envy's tendency to separate and create distance among intimates and neighbors. In unison, these congregated shades cry out a litany of intercession. Mary, Michael, Peter, tutti santi, ora per noi. We are meant to hear the us of liturgical prayer here. This is a communal, not a private service of penance. The eyes of these choristers are sewn shut, like that of hawks in training, to the end of domesticating sight. Dante here codifies a symptom of the envious, namely an incessant and anxious looking at what others possess and what they therefore lack. We ought not to overlook the detail that the chins of these blinded souls are raised up. Though deprived of light now, the envious who turned their gaze in a bad way while on earth, looking at others, looking for the recognition of others, looking expectantly for the misfortune of others, now turn their eyes heavenward. They look toward the gaze of the one who alone secures their identity and heals their dis-ease. True, these souls are not yet enjoying that vinum which is being prepared for them. They are themselves yet the water of their tears, but they await a transformation in which they already cooperate. I want to suggest that these souls on the terrace of envy practice what we worshiping sinners can learn at our present liturgies. Dante's penitents are blinded so that they may come to see what is on display, what is being revealed in the event of each Eucharistic celebration. The question is, how well do we now discern it? Before turning to the marvelous Sophia, we pause to look back into Inferno 13, about which the poet subtly has been reminding us of on this terrace. The parallel cantos in Inferno are situated in the Girone di Violenza, the circle of souls damned because of violence against others, against the self, and against God. Why does envy align fittingly with Dante's perspective on the violent? To begin, it is helpful to recall that in the medieval period, the word violencia conveyed not only the infliction of physical harm, but also the more abstract meaning of a kind of injustice, a distortion of what is natural, expected, owed, as in the phrase, "He did violence to the truth" in his reporting. Recall that on the terrace of envy, the penitents were learning righteous seeing, right worship of God, and a just love of self and other. Each of these is violated in Canto 13 of the Inferno. The forest of suicide is a place of negation and provatio. No green boughs, no smooth branches, no fruit, and no marked path. Dante seems to be echoing the opening lines of the entire Commedia here, in which the pilgrim finds himself in a dark and savage wood, so bitter that death is little more so. In fact, it is the she-wolf of this first canto, associated with the envious Satan, that blocks Dante's path out of the wood. Envy is no one place in hell because it is everywhere. The wood of the suicides is a region where natural unities are undone. The dark thickets serve as perches to the ugly harpies, half human, half carrion birds with claws for feet. Instead of the liturgical chants of Purgatorio 13, the alien cackling of these harpies fills the darkness. Pierre della Vigna, now a thorn bush, narrates how the whore of envy was responsible for extinguishing his bright honors. Envy, he continues, is the common vice and the common death, morte comune, of court life, and by extension, I think, of human life tout court. Though Pierre possessed the power of both keys to Emperor Frederick II's heart, excluding almost everyone else, and though he kept faith and lost sleep and vigor working for Frederick, he no longer possesses the emperor's gaze. He is no one and nothing, sightless and out of sight. Eating only from a table of disdain, Pierre enacts injustice against my just self, and also against the divinely ordered unity of soul and flesh. Concerned with his own honor and not the Creator's, Pierre fails to fulfill his just debt to God. In the envious air of the court, Pierre has, in Pauline language, exchanged the truth about himself, which is discovered in worship, and the truth about God for a lie. Dante uncovers here in hell a pertinacious feature of those trapped in an environment of envy, namely self-obsession and self-pity. Pierre's physical blindness registers his darkened self-absorption. For Dante, suicide is the material realization of envy. So back to Sophia. Returning to Purgatorio 13, Dante uses Sophia's confession, given with the particularity of the confessional, to foreground the most uncharitable aspect of envy, joy over the adversity of another. Sophia accuses herself of rejoicing, quote, much more at the harm done to others than at my own good fortune, close quote. She self-deprecatingly introduces herself as possessing less wisdom than her name would suggest. She reveals also that her identity now is thoroughly enmeshed with the others on the mountain. I was Sienese, and with these others here, I repair my wicked life. weeping to him that he may grant himself to us. Again, this is the liturgical first person plural, right? Petitioning for the communal we. We see into the embittered heart of the envious as Sophia watched her own people, those whom she should love, routed and harmed by the enemy, a sight from which she receives a joy greater than all others. Indeed, she made the horrible petition that God enact vengeance upon her own people. And then, witnessing the fulfillment of her desire, she turned a reckless face, ardita facia, to God, indicating the end of her fear of God. With this gesture, she is no longer sapia. Envy undoes her. Dante reiterates here in Purgatorio that the finis of envy is profound alienation from self, from others, and from God. The envious turn away from the God who is love and whom they imagine has already turned his face from them. Okay, much more quickly, Canto 14 and Guido del Duca, right? He reveals how the invidious forest of the Inferno has emerged on earth in the Arno River Valley of Florence and Tuscany. But we must move ahead quickly to Guido's provocative question. O human race, why do you set your heart where sharing must be forbidden? Why indeed? Envy pits one against another in a battle for scarce commodities, be it the desire for honor, the desire for riches, or the longing to be cherished by one's father, by one's friends, by one's students, and one's colleague. Life becomes an endless jockeying for non-renewable sources. More for one means less for another, or so goes the earthly calculus. At the close of this canto, Virgil releases his own short invective about the stupidity of humans in their seduction by the envious one. The great difficulty in overcoming envy is precisely the question of where one sets one's gaze. And this is Virgil here. The heavens call to you and wheel about you, revealing their eternal beauties, and your eye still gazes upon the earth, and he who sees all things smites you. Virgil provides a significant footnote to his teaching in Canto 15. Because humans fix their desire upon earthly things, the bellows of envy sigh. What is needed instead is a bending of desire upwards. Then only will fear of having less be extinguished. He adds, secondly, that where life is most true, the law of scarcity does not obtain. For there above, where more souls speak of ours, the more of goodness each one possesses, and the more charity burns in that cloister. So the more love a soul sheds abroad in heaven, the more it is filled with an abundance, and the more light and love there is for all who bend toward each other up there. And I underscore those words because this is a reflection of what the penitents are practicing back down in Purgatorio, or in Purgatorio. The Eucharistic liturgy here below conforms our wills to this bending up of desire and bending in mercy toward one another. At the mensa d'amor, there is only ours. The divine eagerness races to where desire is alive in the heart of the worshiper, so that love may be more abundant for all. Okay, I think a couple. Paradiso, quickly in bullet points, I'm afraid, but the antidote to envy is only confirmed above in the parallel cantos in the Paradiso, where Dante Pilgrim and Beatrice travel through the sphere of the sun. The entrance to this sphere is ripe with echoes of the terrace of envy below. In its opening lines, the poet draws attention to light, to gazing, to mutuality, to wisdom and worship, and to the table of love. Loving mutuality is clear in the praise of the Trinitarian act of creation hymned in this sphere. Gazing at the sun with the love that both eternally breathe, the first ineffable power made all that turns in the mind or through space with much order, so that the one who contemplates it cannot be without a taste of him. This created art is loved so deeply by the master that, Virgil says, the poet says that he will never move his eye away from it. Directly addressing the reader, the poet urges a lifting up of the eyes to the high wheels of heaven, for in this realm it is his whole care, tutta la mia cura, to set the table of a feast in which the meats of wisdom are tasted. Allusions to taste, sapore, and wisdom abound in the sphere of the sun, with the appearance of Solomon, Sapia's heavenly counterpart, in Canto 13 and 14, solidifying this connection to the terrace of envy. Solomon, unequaled among kings, earns his high praise because he answers rightly when asked what divine gift he would wish to receive. Solomon asks for what is appropriate to his role in this life and not the gifts accorded to someone else. Healed envy sees what is already given and thus asks for what is fitting from the one whose gaze is never failing. Thank you.
Doing really well on time, thanks to Sabrina. Lanta's got images, I think, right? And
Yes.
so maybe I'll let you do it. I want to introduce Lanta too, while we're getting the PowerPoint ready. She is the author of a beautiful new book, Becoming by Beholding, The Power of the Imagination in Spiritual Formation. She is Professor of Humanities and Literature for the John Wesley Honors College in Indiana Wesleyan, where she teaches classes on the sacramental imagination, beauty, and great texts. So hopefully, yeah, there it is, good. Can we lower the lights at all? I don't know if that's necessary, maybe not, but thank you, Lanta.
Sorry, it won't be that fancy, but. Sin often seems quite simple, but there's a reason that the story of Genesis begins with a serpent. Like the serpent, sin is very good at deceiving us. Like the serpent, it tends to hide, lurking in the shadows. And like the serpent, it deceives us by offering us what we think we want. It makes promises that aren't exactly true. And when we believe their deception, we, like Adam and Eve, suffer the consequences. To prevent sin from slithering its way into our lives, we have to learn its tricks. Sin, early Christians like Evagrius and John Cassian explain, is like a disease that needs proper diagnosis. Otherwise, we might find ourselves paying so much attention to a sneeze that we might miss the cancer spreading through our body. Just as we may have trouble diagnosing a disease of the body, we may have difficulty diagnosing a disease of the soul. We need help to escape our self-deceptions and to see ourselves clearly. Consider the example of David. After taking Bathsheba from Uriah, David does not, at first, acknowledge his wrongdoing. To help David see what he's done, the prophet Nathan tells David a story about a rich man with many cattle and sheep who nevertheless steal a poor man's single precious lamb. David condemns the rich man immediately, lit up with anger about this injustice. Consequently, when Nathan reveals that David is in fact the rich man, David finally confesses, "I have sinned." When we're too close to ourselves and blinded to the truth, art can give us a mirror to peer into our souls. Pablo Picasso described art as the lie that reveals the truth, and art also, I believe, can reveal the lies we tell ourselves. We need to see our vices unveiled, stripped of their disguises and thrust out of their hiding places into the harsh light. The imagination helps make these invisible vices visible. Nathan uses an allegory, a story that shows David his own actions through symbolic representations. Christian artists and writers have imitated Nathan's use of allegory to show us ourselves. In the early 5th century, the Christian poet Prudentius wrote the first pure allegory, a poem called the Psychomachia, or the Battle of the Soul. What if, his poem asks, we could see what was happening in our soul? The Psychomachia depicts the vices and virtues as people at battle, describing each of them in ways that help us understand the nature of the vice. Pride, for instance, sits high on her horse and looks contemptuously down at everyone from it. Greed has a gaping mouth and grasping hands. By imaginatively translating our vices onto bodies, Prudentius helps define each vice and shows the consequences of each sin. The vices are not just abstract things floating into the air, but something happening in and through our bodies. The vices, we can see through Prudentius's eyes, are like guzzling poison and then wondering why we're sick. Dante's Divine Comedy follows and expands Prudentius's allegorical vision. In his Inferno and Purgatory, he also translates sin to the body, showing us the nature of a sin and also how the sin is its own punishment. By giving us visual images of the sins on the body, both Dante and Prudentius give us, in their poetry, the equivalent of Dorian Gray's painting, which you guys see a picture of here. In the picture of Dorian Gray, the real Dorian keeps his good looks, but his dissipated life shows up on his portrait. When Dorian looks at his painting, he visibly sees his soul. Prudentius's and Dante's poetry likewise act as a mirror we can use to peer into our souls. They give the vices bodies so that we can stare and see them for what they are, ugly, deceptive monsters. Through their allegory, we can gaze upon the unseen battle of the soul and see the hell we've made for ourselves. So I'm going to just talk through a little bit more informally a couple of what these look like, and I'm sure I won't have time for all 7 of the vices, but we'll at least get to a couple of them. So Dante and Prudentius both talk about pride. Pride in Prudentius is where we get the phrase, on top of your high horse, because pride is literally on top of a horse, and not just on top of a horse, but perched unstably upon the horse, with lots of pomp, and she has a big hairdo. And what's really significant about what both Dante and Prudentius do is that they always show the vices through the eyes, and pride looks down on others. So from her horse, she's looking contemptuously down on everybody else in the battlefield. In Dante, the pride in Purgatory is purged out by having these heavy boulders down on their back, such that they're hunched over so much they're just able to stare their gaze down on the earth. Because they look down on people in life, here in the Purgatory, they're looking down, forced down with their eyes. But what's really powerful about both Dante and Prudentius is that the vices never have the last say. That in order to correct the vice, to fix the disease, you have to say yes to the practice of the medicine, which is to practice the virtue that will get rid of the vice. So in Dante, in the Purgatory, one of my favorite things about it is that every vice is punished by practicing the virtue. So even though staring down symbolizes the pride they saw and practiced in life, it also reminds them of their humility, that we are created from dust, and to dust we shall return. Pride in Dante is a way of reminding us that when we take ourselves so seriously, we take the weight of the world on our shoulders. Desidera, the word for desire, comes from literally a removal from the stars. And Dante reminds us that pride is essentially our effort to reach the stars by our own efforts, our own behalf. And so when we do that, we place the whole weight of the world on our shoulders. And by doing that, we make ourselves a kind of worm almost, rather than the butterflies we're created to be. So by practicing humility, by actually remembering that from dust we were made, and to dust we shall return, we're able to practice the humility that reminds us that it is through God that we will be given wings to fly to the stars, and not through our own efforts. Humility in Prudentius actually has to do very little, because pride actually unseats herself. She falls into the pit that she doesn't realize, the pit of deception, and manages to unseat herself from her own fall. So you see in the middle there that she has fallen off of her high horse into the pit. And I also just included, I really appreciate Paul Cadmus is a contemporary artist who's done a few of personifications of the 7 vices, and I love his depiction of pride as being puffed up. which is another description that Prudentius uses for pride. This kind of puffed up with our own self-importance, our self-inflated sense of who we are. And we've already heard a little bit about envy, so I probably won't have to go into as much depth with that. But one of the other things that I really appreciate about Dante and Prudentius is that they give us these visual images of what the vices are to help us understand the basic definition, to help us understand them better. But they also give us the virtues and vices through exemplars. What do they look like lived out? Who are people who especially exemplify that vice or that virtue? And so Dante uses Ovid's description of envy in his canto, and I really love that. And this middle painting is actually from Giotto, and it's the closest I can get to what Ovid kind of describes envy as. Ovid describes envy as a woman who just feeds on venom. So she's this kind of wasted away creature who lives in a cave, and it's all foggy, so it gets at that sense of not seeing things correctly. It's always a little bit cool in the cave. There's never the warmth that there should be. And she purposely feeds on snakes. So she's feeding herself venom, but only ever half snakes. And I love this because it reminds us that envy is something that is a kind of self-poisoning. And I like to tell my students, for instance, things like Instagram. We kind of feed ourselves this poison of envy and continually compare ourselves against other people and willingly swallow that down. But also envy is never satisfied. So even after she's taken the snake, it's never enough. So there's like these half-body carcasses of snake all living around her. As a reminder to us that envy is something that's never satisfied, that as soon as I reach one point of success, I'll all of a sudden compare myself to somebody who's just a little bit higher than me, and then somebody who's just a little bit higher than me. And so envy can be this completely unsatisfied thing that just keeps us continually poisoning ourselves. And because she's continually feeding on her own venom, she poisons everything beautiful around her. So envy will go on a walk and her breath will actually make flowers and things like that wither around her. And it's, again, a reminder that envy is really something that spoils beauty for ourselves, that it spoils our experiences that should be really good and should be something that brings us together, and instead we poison them because we are feeding ourselves with that venom. So in Dante, he has the envious, as you've described, actually have their eyes stitched together. So if pride is looking down, I always think of envy as sort of like the side eye, looking askance, kind of like a runner will lose a race if they accidentally look to the side and measure themselves against somebody else instead of keeping their eyes forward. And so Dante's envious are sewn up with this iron wire, and to help them practice that charity, they actually are leaning against each other. So unlike the tears of envy that they cried in life, because what's really pernicious about envy is that it actually mourns when people find joy, and it feels joy when other people mourn. So here it's a kind of false tear that envy sheds, and so envy has tears coming out of their sewn shut eyes as a reminder of the proper kind of tears, which is that we're called to mourn with those who are mourning and to celebrate with those who are celebrating. And so proper charity is recognizing that we need each other. So when they lean against each other in the terrace of envy, they're not looking at each other side-eyed as competition, but realizing that instead we are all in it together, essentially, one another's support, and that when one person is strong, it helps make all of us strong. And so all of them leaning on each other is a great counter for envy's pernicious snakes. The terrace of wrath. Wrath is something that pops up in both Prudentius and in Dante. And I really love the depiction in Prudentius describes this warrior who's just like flinging weapons all over the place, like everything that she possibly has. And she has bloodshot eyes, she's hysterical, she's frothing at the mouth. Dante describes the wrathful in purgatory as actually being surrounded by smoke and a foul, bitter air. And in Prudentius, what's really fascinating, you see this in Giotto's depiction too, where wrath is kind of tearing herself apart, that wrath is actually its own self-destruction. So wrath ends up actually committing suicide, falling on her own sword in Prudentius because she wears herself out with all of this rage. And it's a good reminder to us that Even when wrath might start from a spark of injustice, that may even be a proper response. Anger is sometimes a proper response to an injustice, that wrath takes things too far. And when wrath takes things too far, ultimately we end up actually hurting ourselves. So I might get mad at my husband for something small that he did, and I might overreact to that. And in the process, I might hurt his feelings, but ultimately I would also hurt myself by damaging a relationship that I hold really dear. And both Dante and Prudentius help get at that self-defeating quality of wrath. That in the midst of all of the smoke in the purgatory that people can't see, they're bumping into each other constantly and causing themselves injury in the process. So wrath might begin by trying to hurt others, but in fact it always ends up hurting yourself. There's always a kind of self-inflicted wound in the process. So again, thinking about just the way that eyes oftentimes represent this, we have pride looking down, envy looking askance or side-eyed, and we have wrath as seeing red, as this fuming, anger-filled inability to see. And so in Dante, while the wrathful are purging their wrath, they're also practicing meekness. So amidst all of this inability to see correctly and all the smoke around them, the only way that they can get around is by listening to one another, that they navigate by opening their ears. So amidst our eyes being unable to see things correctly, we have to have the patience, the meekness to be able to listen, to understand, and to be able to hopefully open our ears to hear other people speaking amidst our own blindness. I maybe have one more, time for one more. Acedia is actually one of my favorites, and I think one that isn't discussed all that much. But Dante talks about acedia as the purging of acedia is actually running really fast over and over and over again in a kind of race. And he describes it as a whole frenzied mob, but it's not actually laziness, but a lack of love, a lack of a love of good. And so he talks about it as a kind of slackened or a lukewarmness to do good. And so it's really interesting to think about here the eyes are kind of dull, have kind of gone blank. I almost think about it as like the 1,000-yard stare that you sometimes see where you're just a little bit checked out from what you've seen and done. So here, thinking about acedia not just as laziness, but actually as a kind of lack of love, a lack of interest, a lack of zeal, Dante will say. And again, it's not just about doing more for Dante because they're running in circles really fast. It's also a reminder to us that acedia can actually look like busyness, like workaholic kind of ism, because that too is a kind of diminishment of the joy that we ought to bring to our work, that it too is a running around in circle and a forgetting of why we're doing that to begin with. And so acedia is both things, a kind of lacklusterness in terms of our daily duty, but also a lacklusterness that can come from doing too much, from burning ourselves out. And so we're reminded in this that zeal is something akin to being a kid who, even after 50 times of reading the same book, will say, do it again, I love it, I want it again. And so disciplines, the disciplines of zeal are practices, prayer too, this repetition that we continually bring renewed love to. The zeal that is ever fresh and ever green helps us to remember to combat acedia's frenzied mobness, its rushness, its lackluster noonday demon that's trying to lure us away from what God has called us to do. There's all sorts of other things that I could talk about, but instead I'll wrap up here and just kind of think through, as soon as I find it, my ending. So looking inward rather than outward is no easy feat. We spend so much time concentrating often on fearing external monsters. It's much easier, right, to point the figure out than it is to point it in. That it can be shocking when we finally see the monsters within. After all, the vices are very good at appearing beautiful, fun, exciting. They're masters of slowly luring us in with empty promises and tantalizing dreams. Those dreams, however, quickly become nightmares when they are unmasked. Underneath their appealing disguises are hideous monsters who put burdens on our backs and chains on our feet. We need to learn our own tricks, to spot the ways we wrongly convince ourselves that what we are doing is right and good. To do so requires an unforgiving, glaringly accurate mirror that shows us ourselves. Dante and Prudentius offer us the very effective mirror of the imagination. helping us to see that sin is its own punishment. The vices trap us in our own personal hell. We sometimes imagine, I think, God is a kind of tyrant judge who demands blood restitution for being wronged. But God does not need to punish us for our sins. Our sin already does that. You, it says in Prudentius, are the chief road to perdition and the gate of... Oh man, sorry, I had my alarm to remind myself of the time and it actually went off. But God does not need to punish us for our sin. Our sin does that already. So this is Prudentius. You are the chief road to perdition and the gate of hell, one of Prudentius's virtues, taunts of vice she has just conquered. You corrupt our bodies and sink our souls into hell. Lower your head into the bitter abyss, you icy pestilence. Die, be shut up in hell. The words sound harsh, and the battle is shockingly bloody and brutal for one of the first Christian works of literature. But the vices are enemies who deserve such ruthlessness. Vices are indeed gates of death that sink our souls into hell, as Prudentius says. So if we wish to fight for good and battle corruption, we have to start by battling the hell that lives in the soul. We too must command our vices to die.
Beautiful. Well, come on up, Abe and Michon. We'll have questions as they're getting up here. I just want to say I'm thinking of, we're at Our Lady's University. One of the beautiful things Dante does is have those who are purging the vice meditate, first of all, on an image of Mary. You may know this, the humility in the Annunciation, the calm she says, with which she addresses Jesus at the temple, the generosity at Cana, the zeal, the haste with which she goes to Elizabeth. But I'm sure you have ideas percolating. I think Vittorio is back there, one of our master Dantistas. Anyway, wherever you are with Dante, questions, responses, reflect. Please, Father.
I'm going to do something that I hate, making a comment.
A comment followed by questions, which is good. Stand up so everybody can hear you.
Well, a very exciting connection, at least for me. Thank you all for your wonderful. A very exciting connection that I think ties them all together. So we started talking about the way Dante uses the language of ombra and shadow. It's a very exciting appearance of that language at the beginning of Purgatorio 13 that you almost hit. You know, it's in the Nicola verse. It says Nicola ne ombra appear. It's because ombra is used as an image. It means artistic image, and that ties into it's relating back to the images of pride and humility in Purgatorio 10 and 12 as well. So there's this one connection among and it was just making me think through the entire presentation. The idea of ne ombra, or like how envy, there's kind of like a mesthesis of art that has to take place through the purgation of envy and growth in charity and mercy towards others. At what point does art maybe get in the way of, or like, at what point does art maybe need to be not as imagistic, or maybe pushing towards the drawing of other senses, like sound and hearing? Anyway, maybe that's where I want to go with the question.
Lanta has a new book with a lot of art in it. Maybe you want to take it first. Why don't you?
That's a good question. Trying to think through it here. I think Dante, at least in Purgatory, does have concerns about art in that he's worried that if it distracts you from the soul's ascent, is when it starts to become problematic. So Cato actually urges them on, right? After they kind of sing the song and get distracted. And so it could be more so any form of art than maybe just the eye or the visual. I just hesitate at least to think with Dante with the eye, because his whole journey is so motivated with cleansing the eye and the beatific vision that it's always about just keeping your eyes in the right direction. So if art distracts you from that gaze upwards, that's where the problem to me ends up occurring.
Others? Any thoughts, or you?
I think there's something even stronger going on in Dante. After a feast of visual images, I feel like in the long run, the Paradiso cuts against that almost completely. And it's almost as if, as you go through the poem, you're required to stop using your visual imagination. I think that that's one of the reasons the last time a soul is called Ombra is pretty early on in 5. And it's not clear to me to what degree there are any, I don't know what to call them, visual analogies, visual metaphors later in the poem.
Well, at the end, you have.
I know, that's-
The Trinity
Yep.
and the Incarnation.
Yep.
And he can't explain it. He can't, it's
Yeah.
like, trying to square the circle, he says.
Yeah.
But he does see our human image, right? Our human effigy, however it is in Italian, I'm not sure, but that's a crucial moment. That's
Yeah.
when the love enters him and he moves on to write the poem.
It's imago, if I recall.
Imago, yeah.
Yeah, if I
Isn't it?
recall
Yeah.
correctly.
Vittorio?
It's La Nostra Effigie,
Ah.
the Italian there, and I think, but I
Our
think
effigy.
thank you, thank you, thank you for some wonderful presentations, and I do think that there's something that brings them all together, and think about the Incarnation, I think, can help us think together about what it is that brings the papers together. There's this dynamic, whether we're thinking about envy, whether we're thinking about shade, there's this dynamic between who we are as not yet where we can be and who we are as perfected in beatitude. And there can be, one thing that Dante, I think, consciously tries to navigate is sort of working against the temptation of thinking about our embodied selves as a problem. Our embodied selves are not a problem, but there are things we need to work through. And I think thinking about the Incarnation in this context, what the Incarnation means for Dante, can be very important. One thing that I wanted to ask, comment on, bring to the conversation is, what do we do with the fact that Dante tells us that envy is not something that he thinks he has a lot of? Pride in abundance. Envy, not so much. And it's interesting that I think it's right that by far the most common noun in the comedy is I. By far. Used way more often than love, God, or any other thing we might imagine. So Dante is encouraging us to see, delights in seeing in a way. And there's something about that dynamic between us seeing and being seen that, and also related to the dynamic between introspection and opening up to others, that I think can help us reflect on the questions that the papers have raised. If we're thinking about the shade, recognizing that our bodies get in the way, but also are the means by which we relate. And the way that shadow is used throughout the comedy can help us think about that. The way in which we, reading vertically, by the time we get to the Paradiso, seeing others and being with others is key to beatitude. And I love the invitation to think about sort of art as introspection, and I think that's really underestimated in our interpretation of Dante. So I'm not sure. Sorry, these were just sort of a number of comments.
We're
But
glad to have them from you, Vittorio. Thank you.
But I guess the question, a very interesting question there, what do we do with the fact that Dante says that envy is not something that he thinks he has?
Yeah. In the longer version of this paper, I think about that a lot, because here's Sophia giving a very sort of personal confession, right, of her sin. And Dante, at first you want to think that Dante wants to respond to that very personal confession with his own, right, about pride. So maybe he just skips over envy, right, to get to his own personal confession. that was one of the options that I was thinking about. The other is, I wonder if he really doesn't suffer from envy. In the Paradiso, when Caccio Guida, right, is very careful to tell him, don't envy, right, your neighbors when you are in exile, right? And Dante is this very sort of proud and honorable man, and now he's walking up and down the steps of other people's houses and eating, bread that doesn't taste like his own. So I just wonder if he has felt, right, that temptation to envy himself. But it seems like he focuses on the pride in his response to Sepia. But then, right, in Canto 14, with Guido del Duco's, diatribe against the envious, hating Florentines and Romans, I think Dante is really, really fearful of the damage that envy does. And so it's almost like he's avoiding it or pushing it away. I mean, that was some of what I was thinking about when I was reading it.
Would you not agree, all Dante readers, this is that he's learning more about himself along the way? Maybe he doesn't quite know. What's the first question he asked Piccarda? Don't you envy the people that are a bit closer? You're in the moon. Don't you want a better seat? I mean, that's a question that from somebody who knows a little bit of envy, Maybe he's coming to become aware of it, along the way.
And just in relationship to the question of art and no segno, when you get to the sphere of the sun, which is the parallel, right, to envy, there are some images, but they are more abstract, like the double crown, right, suggestive of mutuality, right, which envy, cannot recognize. But it is a much more abstract sort of image. There's something else I was going to say, but I can't. Oh, and at the end of Solomon, the wise one, right, is also the one who speaks about getting the resurrected bodies back, right? So to your point about the incarnation, right, there is, I mean, even though envy is absence and sort of anti-life and even, right, suicidal in terms of oneself and one's relationship with others, there is this, right, sense that of the great joy that's going to come when people embodied again are all seeing rightly, right, without envy.
That's beautifully said. Well, I'm seeing my watch, and it tells me it's 4:30, so we have time built in to come up and talk to some of the speakers, if you'd like, talk casually, but can we give our speakers another round of applause, please?